There's a good chance you've been drinking this family's wine your whole adult life without ever knowing their name. Barefoot, Apothic, Carlo Rossi, Andre, Black Box. That's all one family. So is the High Noon in your cooler, and that's just a tenth of what they own. They run the largest winery on Earth from a farm town in California. They're worth around $12 billion, and in 93 years they have never sold one share to an outsider. No stock, no shareholders, and nobody to answer to. But the reason this family stays so quiet starts with two bodies on a ranch, found 2 months before they ever sold a bottle. This is the crazy story of the Gallo family and how they built their $12 billion empire. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Ranch in Fresno County. To understand why this family disappeared, you have to start with what they were running from. On June 21, 1933, sheriff's deputies were called out to a ranch in Fresno County. They found two bodies: Giuseppe Gallo, an Italian immigrant from the Piedmont region, and his wife Assunta, who everybody called Susie. The county records say Joseph shot his wife and then he shot himself. Nobody has ever fully explained why he did it. The family had been squeezed hard by the Depression, there were debts, and there was a great business that wasn't working. What there also were that morning were 3 sons who woke up with parents and went to bed without them. Ernest was 24, Julio was 23, their little brother Joseph was 13 years old. Now think about what most people do at that moment. They grieve. They sell the ranch. They take a job somewhere. 2 months later, Ernest and Julio started a winery. The timing was not sentimental, it was strategic. Prohibition was ending that December. America was about to be legally thirsty for the first time in 13 years, and these two had spent their whole childhood around grapes. Ernest had been shipping his father's fruit east to Chicago by rail since he was 17, and selling it there himself by 18. Home winemaking stayed legal all through Prohibition, so grapes were one of the few things in the whole business you could still move in daylight. So they knew the crop cold. What neither of them had ever actually done was make wine. Not once. So Ernest went to the Modesto Public Library and pulled out a couple of old pamphlets on winemaking that had been sitting on the shelf since before Prohibition. That was the education. 2 pamphlets from a public library in a farm town. The money came from Ernest's mother-in-law, Teresa Franzia, who lent them $5,900. That's about $140,000 in today's money. And yes, if the name Franzia sounds familiar to you, that is the same Franzia family whose box wine is probably in a fridge somewhere near you right now. They rented a ramshackle building in Modesto and got to work, and their pricing strategy was about as subtle as a brick. They sold their wine for 50 cents a gallon, roughly half of what everybody else in California was charging. In that first year alone, they produced 177,000 gallons out of that building and cleared $30,000 in profit, which in 1934 was a serious amount of money for 2 kids who had learned the trade out of a library pamphlet. 2 orphans, a library pamphlet, and a borrowed $5,000. That is the entire seed of a $12 billion empire. And from day one, the brothers split the job in 2. Julio would make the wine, Ernest would sell it. And Ernest turned out to be one of the most ruthless salesmen this country has ever produced. Chapter 2. The Man Who Owned the Shelf. Here's the thing most people get wrong about Gallo. They think it's a wine company. It isn't, not really. It's a distribution company that happens to own vineyards. Ernest Gallo figured out something in the 1940s that the rest of the wine industry took another 40 years to understand. Making great wine doesn't matter if nobody can find it. What matters is the shelf. Who controls the shelf controls the category. So Ernest went to war for the shelf, and he built a sales force that he trained like an army. His people did not simply drop off cases and leave. They walked into liquor stores and rearranged the displays themselves, counted the competition's bottles on the shelf, and reported the numbers back to Modesto. Ernest wanted to know what was moving in every store in America, and he wanted his own products sitting at eye level in all of them. He was famous for showing up unannounced at a distributor and asking questions nobody could answer. His own summary of the strategy is one of the great quotes in American business. "We don't want most of the business," he said. "We want it all." Speaking of wanting it all, there's a program someone on our team has been curious about called the Billionaire Brain Wave. It's a simple 7-minute audio built around theta brainwave research. the deep focus brain state linked to where big creative ideas come from. You put on headphones once a day, usually with your morning coffee, and that's the whole routine. It's a one-time $39. It comes with bonus guides on money habits and investing basics, and there's a 90-day money-back guarantee. So testing it costs you nothing if it's not for you. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to Modesto, and the move that put the whole machine in the Gallo family's hands. But the part that really tells you who you're dealing with is what happened next, because Ernest looked at his supply chain and decided he didn't want to depend on anybody for anything. Wine needs bottles. So in the late 1950s, Gallo built its own glass plant in Modesto. Not a small one either. Gallo Glass is now the largest glass container plant in North America, running around $750 million a year on its own. Bottles need caps. So in 1961, they started an aluminum company to make their own caps and foil. And the whole thing needs to get to the store. So that same year, they started their own trucking company. Look at what that actually means in practice. They grow the grapes and they crush the grapes. They manufacture the glass the wine goes into and the metal that goes on top of it. They load it onto their own trucks. And then their own sales force walks it into the store and puts it at eye level, pointed straight at your face. There is no step in that chain where an outside company gets to set the price or hold up the schedule. Plenty of companies talk about vertical integration now. Gallo was doing it with an entire agricultural product decades before anybody had a business school phrase for it. But there was a catch. To build all that, Ernest needed volume, enormous volume. And the fastest way to move enormous volume of cheap wine in mid-century America turned out to be the ugliest chapter in the family's history. Chapter 3. What's the word? In 1957, Gallo released a product called Thunderbird. On paper, it was a simple product, a citrus-flavored fortified wine, sold cheap, with the alcohol content pushed up to around 20%, which is roughly double what you get in a normal glass of red. It was legal, it was popular, and it made an absolute fortune. But it sold best in one very specific kind of place. It sold best in the poorest neighborhoods in America. Because if you have almost no money, Thunderbird was the most alcohol you could possibly buy per dollar. That was the entire value proposition, whether Gallo said it out loud or not. There was a jingle built entirely around a call and response about what the word was, and the answer was always Thunderbird. People still recite it. The brand became so tied to Skid Row that the name itself turned into shorthand for a certain kind of desperation, and it stayed that way for 50 years. And Thunderbird was not alone in that lineup. There was Ripple, there was Night Train, and there was Boone's Farm, which was sweet enough that for a generation of Americans, it functioned as the first alcoholic thing they ever tasted. Gallo did not invent cheap fortified wine, and they were not the only ones selling it, but they were the biggest name in the category by a distance. And for decades, those bottles were paying for the glass plant, the trucks, the vineyards, and everything else you have heard about so far. By the 1980s, the backlash arrived. Cities and community groups across the country started campaigning against high-alcohol fortified wine in low-income neighborhoods. Some pushed for outright bans on the category in specific zip codes. And in 1989, under public pressure and, by several accounts, pressure from inside the family itself, Gallo asked its own distributors to stop selling its flavored fortified wines to retailers in low-income areas. Now, you can read that two ways, and both readings are fair. It was a company doing the right thing about a product that was hurting people. It was also a company that had spent 30 years taking that money first. What is not debatable is what it cost them commercially. By the 80s, the Gallo name meant cheap. It meant jug wine. It meant the bottom shelf. And Ernest Gallo, a man who had spent his entire life obsessed with what the customer thinks when they look at a label, could not stand it. So the family started buying its way up market, quietly, under other people's names. We'll come back to that because it's how they ended up owning your wine rack without you noticing. But first there's the lawsuit, because while Ernest was fighting for the family's reputation, he was about to go to federal court against his own brother. Chapter 4. Gallo versus Gallo. Remember the 13-year-old? When their parents died in 1933, Ernest and Julio didn't put their little brother into care. They took him in. Ernest and his wife Amelia, Julio and his wife Eileen, they raised Joseph themselves. Joseph grew up, served in the Army Air Forces during the war, and then went into a completely different business. Not wine, dairy. He built one of the largest family-owned dairy operations in the world out in the Central Valley. And by the mid-1980s, he had started putting his cheese into retail stores with his own name on the label, Joseph Gallo. And in April of 1986, his brothers sued him for it. The winery's argument was straightforward trademark law. Gallo was their mark, they'd spent 50 years building it, and cheese with Gallo on the label would confuse customers and dilute the brand. They asked the court to stop him from using his own last name on his own product. So Joseph countersued. And his counterclaim is the part that makes this a family tragedy instead of a business dispute, because Joseph didn't just want to sell cheese. He claimed he owned a third of the winery. His argument went like this. Their father was in the wine business before Prohibition. Their father built a concrete fermentation tank on the ranch shortly before he died, which suggests he was planning to restart a winery the moment Prohibition ended. Ernest and Julio used their father's grapes. They sold under the same Gallo name their parents had used on barrels years earlier. And here's the sharpest point Joseph had. In their own trademark filings, Ernest and Julio had at times described the winery as a continuation of their father's business. So which was it? Was the winery something the two of them built from nothing? Or was it their father's company, which would make it part of an estate that all three sons should have shared? The court never really answered that question because it didn't have to. Back in the 1930s, a probate judge had already ruled on the estate, and that ruling treated the winery as Ernest and Julio's own business. Joseph, as a minor, had received a payment of $20,000 out of it. 50 years later, the court said that decision was final and could not be reopened. So Joseph lost, and he was permanently barred from selling retail cheese with the Gallo name on the label. He renamed the company Joseph Farms, and it is still running today, still in the family, still making cheese a couple of hours from the winery that took his name off it. The brothers never repaired it. Julio died first, in 1993, when his Jeep rolled on a ranch near Tracy, California. And then in 2007, Joseph died on February 17th and Ernest died on March 6th. 17 days apart. Ernest was 97. Three brothers who buried their parents together in 1933, and two of them went to their graves 74 years later not speaking. Chapter 5. The Invisible Empire. Now let's talk about what that family actually owns, because this is the part that surprises people. Start with Barefoot. Gallo bought it in 2005 from the two people who built it, and then pointed that distribution machine at it. Barefoot is now the best-selling table wine brand in the United States, not one of, the one. Then keep going down the aisle. Apothic, with the dark bottle and the heavy blends. Carlo Rossi, in the jug your uncle keeps by the sink. Dark Horse, Liberty Creek, Bella Sera, Peter Vella, and Bear Flag. Andre, which has been at roughly every graduation party in America since the 60s. Alamos out of Argentina, and La Marca Prosecco, which is the bottle at more or less every bridal shower in the country. And it goes up market too, which is the part nobody clocks. William Hill in Napa. Louis Martini. Orange Swift, which was a seriously fashionable cult label when they bought it in 2016. J Vineyards. Talbot. If you have ever spent $50 on a bottle to impress someone, there is a real chance that was Gallo as well. Then in January of 2021, they did something remarkable. Constellation Brands, a publicly traded company, decided to dump its cheaper wine brands to make its numbers look better for shareholders. Gallo bought more than 30 of them in one transaction. Black Box, Clos du Bois, Franciscan, Ravenswood, Manischewitz, Arbor Mist, Wild Horse, Estancia. The deal was originally structured at around $1.7 billion, and it was big enough that the Federal Trade Commission stepped in and said it would reduce competition across 6 separate product categories. Gallo had to strip pieces back out of it before regulators would sign off, and the version that finally closed came in at roughly $810 million. Sit with the shape of that for a second. A public company was selling brands because Wall Street wanted a prettier margin. A private family was buying them because they answered to nobody. That is the whole thesis of this video in one transaction. And they weren't finished. In 2019, Gallo launched a vodka seltzer called High Noon. By 2022, it had crossed $1 billion in retail sales. Within about 4 years of launch, it was the top-selling spirits brand in the United States by volume, moving something like 25 million cases a year, and it turned a wine company into the second-largest spirits producer in America. And in 2022, they broke ground on a $423 million production and glass facility in South Carolina, so that they could do on the East Coast exactly what they have been doing in Modesto since 1958. 90 years in, the family is still building its own bottle factories. More than 130 brands, 94 million cases, and almost nobody outside the industry can name the family. Which raises the obvious question. With numbers like that, why has this company never gone public? Chapter 6. The family Wall Street can't touch. Here's the honest answer. They never went public because going public would have made them worse at this. Think about what a wine business actually is. You plant a vineyard, and it gives you nothing for 3 or 4 years. It doesn't hit real quality for closer to 7. A barrel program ties money up for years before a single bottle is sold. A brand you buy today might take a decade to become barefoot. Now imagine explaining that on a quarterly earnings call. Imagine telling analysts that you've spent 9 figures on dirt that will produce revenue sometime around the next presidential administration. Public companies can't do that, or rather they can, but the stock gets punished every 3 months while they try. Gallo simply does not have that problem. There is no ticker symbol, there is no analyst on the other end of the phone, and there is nobody outside the family that anybody has to explain anything to, and you can watch that difference play out in real time. Constellation sold off 30 brands to make a quarter look better for its shareholders, and Gallo stood there and bought them. One company had to justify its portfolio to Wall Street. The other one had to justify it to a handful of relatives in Modesto. Today, about 15 family members across 3 generations work in the business. The chief executive is a man named Ernest J. Gallo, the founder's grandson, carrying the founder's name, running the company out of the same town where 2 orphans rented a shed in 1933. And they're still doing the thing. They bought rum chata, they bought Fisher's Island lemonade, they put money into a beer brand. They're the official wine and vodka of the NFL, the NHL, and the UFC, which means they're advertising to 100 million people while remaining completely anonymous as a family. So think about your own week for a second. You had a glass of red with dinner, and that was Gallo. Somebody brought a bottle to the cookout, and that was Gallo. You grabbed a High Noon at the tailgate, Gallo. Your friend brought the box down to the beach, almost certainly Gallo. You picked out the nice bottle for your anniversary, and there is a very good chance that was Gallo too. They are in your fridge, they are in your cabinet, they are in the cooler at the game, and they have been for 90 years, and you never once had to know who they were. Frank Mars wanted the lifestyle. Bob Wien wanted to be liked. Ernest Gallo wanted the shelf. And out of all the American food dynasties, the Gallos may be the only ones who got every single thing they wanted and paid for it in a currency nobody talks about, which was each other. So what do you think? Is total privacy the smartest move a family business can make? Or does a company this big owe the public more than silence? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden empires behind the brands you use every day, make sure to like and subscribe to Global Status. We'll see you in the next one.